Fundamentally, you want to make sure you're remembering these things when you're working on a flat sketch for a bottom or a pant or short or a skirt or a skirt or whatever it is. You want to make sure you're paying attention to the length, the out seam as well as the inseam. You want to be aware of where it's falling at your waist. You want to be aware of how wide it is at your waist or your hips. You want to pay close attention to things like the sweep and the leg opening. How much is it collapsing? How circular does it look? And additionally, you want to focus on your closure. How are you going to get into the garment, as well as sketching it so it looks appropriate to the fabrication. For some applied examples, we can talk about spill and leg opening. So I have this sketch here, which this is literally what this sketch might look like in some respects. It might be a little bit long, so I'm just going to shorten it a little bit. But functionally, I want this to be like a pant that is a little bit baggy at the ankle. It has some spill. You can see I've added some of these lines here in order to really just add some dimension, show that parts of it are collapsing. And that gives you a better idea as to what it looks like in your mind than this option does. So in this option, you can see it might make sense literally as, if you were to put it on a hanger, it would drop as such. But sometimes when you're actually sketching up flats, you don't want to be showing it as it always would be on the hanger, because that can make it look confusing from your look, or from the design perspective, or from how you want it to be presented, or for the full look itself. It's also going to depend on if you have illustrations, if you have samples that you're showing with the garments, you name it. So otherwise, you would want to be cautious of something like your leg opening, because if you have an extremely wide leg pant, you want to make sure you're illustrating that appropriately, and that can be as simple as adjusting some of these points here. You can see that this one didn't come with. However, working on a sketch in this sense where it looks a little bit more collapsed can sometimes help illustrate things like leg opening or how much it's filling. Additionally, we have crotch depth and the rise. So one thing you want to illustrate on your pant sketches or your short sketches, if it's a trouser-based sketch, is you want to make sure you're indicating with this little S and this little wave. This will make sure you're looking at the front and the back. So with this little S here, it's pretty straightforward. You can just take something like the pen tool, and you can just, draw your little shape. You would then want to make some adjustments in the stroke weight, and eventually when we get to it, like the width profile, you would utilize something like this in order to make it look a little bit more realistic. If I ungroup. This is just illustrating really where and I don't want there to be fill on that. This is just illustrating where sort of the crotch is ending, and also it's a clear indication that this is the front. With this being the back, you can do the same thing here. You would just take your pen tool and kind of draw this swoosh line. And at that point, it's just going to really, again, remind you that this is the back, and it's also going to show that there's a clear end to the rise seam. With pants especially, you want to make sure you're indicating your fly seam with a little bit of depth. This is going to come with sort of when we talk about shadows a little bit later on, but functionally, if I have my pant sketch, as you can see, the left and right side of my sketch is one piece. So when I was sketching this up, I flipped it over and I used Shape Builder, or I just joined my seams. But now you can see this center front seam is just a line. In general, you would then want to make sure there's a little bit of variation in your line between where the actual opening is and the seam of the body. So what I mean by that is if you were to select this line and go over here to your scissors tool, I would actually cut it right where the crotch seam, or right where this fly stitching stopped, and I would make this line a little bit thicker. And so you can see now the actual center front seam is 0.5 point, whereas this one is 0.75. And that just gives it a little bit more dimension. It makes it a little bit more understandable as to what's going on, and it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So additionally, you would then want to make sure you're adding in a shadow here. And this, again, we'll talk about a little bit later, but you would just be drawing your shape. You would just be drawing a shape and then utilizing a completely black fill is what I usually recommend at like a 15 or a 20% opacity, and just adding that there, which makes it look a little bit more dimensional and makes it clear that this is a scene that is going over the actual, it's overlapping over fabric. And then lastly is also similar with the pant illustration, is to just make sure you're indicating circularity, and this really refers to the sweep. So when we talk about the sweep, this sketch looks very rigid. So it looks like the hem is actually standing out like this and is sort of conical. And then this one here, I can have a better idea that it's actually very full and that it's a little bit softer. It's giving you some cones here. And this is fairly easily done. We're just going to, first I'm going to start by deleting my stitch. And I'm just going to go to my Add Anchor Point tool and add about, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, an even number. And then I'm just going to start raising and lowering these and making some adjustments as I go. So I'm just going to start by alternating raising and lowering my sketch, my points, in order to illustrate some conical action going on. And then you can even then just start rotating as appropriate your anchor points. And when you start rotating them, you can see that I'm getting a little bit more definition now into what would be my cones. Of course, you would then want to really just like make sure that this is looking good for your sketches. You would want to make those adjustments. You would also then want to make sure it's just like not looking super lopsided like mine is at the moment. And you would just do that by kind of making these adjustments, working with it as you go, and then you would be then adding in some lines with your pen tool. And you would use some variable width, which we'll talk about in our next episode. And with these lines, you would want them to be disappearing into the same point if it's forward. So I want to illustrate that this one is coming forward, this cone, and so I'm then now having these two drag lines disappear into the same relative area. As you can see here, this one is more forward, so then they almost go to the same vanishing point, just like this one does here as well. And so when you've added these lines in, you can then go back in and make some adjustments to them by, let me just ungroup. You can make some adjustments by editing the variable width here. This will make it look a little bit more realistic. It'll also make it look a little bit more professional and finished. You can then drop your shadows in, and you would just be copying your hem and making that your stitch line. And so those are just some quick tips on how to, in general, improve some of your bottom sketches. Of course, it's all really going to come down to practice. And so in our next video, we're going to focus a little bit more on utilizing brushes and symbols and variable width in order to make your Illustrator flats look a little bit more professional, a little bit cleaner, and a little bit more finalized. And so I hope you've learned a lot in this lesson, and I will see you next time. Bye.